Hi everyone! Today we're going to start sewing our collared shirt. The first portion of the shirt will be sewing the back. We'll assemble the back with princess seams and a back yoke, and then we will also move on to complete the pocket as well as front facings. To begin sewing our shirt's back, you will need one mid-back and two side backs. You'll want to have them laid out on your work surface with the right side of the fabric facing up. The right side of the fabric always means whatever you want visible on the outside, and the wrong side of the fabric is the side that's intended to be on the inside of the garment when it's completed. Some fabrics don't have a clear right or wrong side, like muslin or many other plain weaves if they don't have a print or any sort of design on the right side. If this applies to your fabric, then you'll want to take extra care to still lay out your pieces so that the side backs are making a mirror image of one another, meaning they are facing opposite directions. While they're in that position, you may want to flip your fabric up and use any sort of marking device to mark an X to indicate the wrong side of all your pieces. We're going to start by sewing princess seams to attach the side backs to the mid back. We'll be forming these seams by placing the right sides of the fabric together, and we'll sew those seams at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, backstitching both ends. Start by taking your first side and flip it over onto the mid back so that the right sides of the fabric are touching. You could set the other side back aside for the moment as we begin our pinning. Whenever pinning a seam, particularly a long one, like the one we're about to sew for the princess seam, it's especially important that you never start your pins at one end and just work them all the way down to the other. Sometimes, even if your fabric was cut correctly and the seams are the same length, you may get to the end of your pinning and find that the bottom ends of your seam do not match. So the rule of pinning is to always start by pinning the beginning and end points of your seam first, and then coming in and pinning together any notches or other crucial points that need to be matched up. So I'm going to come all the way up here to the top end of my seam and pull the corners of the fabric together so that they are perfectly met where the notches are at the top edge. Whenever you're pinning, the preferred direction for pins is to always orient them perpendicular to the direction that you are sewing. This helps the layers of the fabric to be more evenly distributed across your stitch line, and thus resulting in a less ripply looking seam. After pinning the very top, I'm going to come all the way down here and pull the bottoms together. Don't even mind what's happening up here yet, we'll be adjusting it, but you just want to pull those corners of the fabric together and pin again, perpendicular to the princess seam. After you have the beginning and end points of your seam pinned, you'll next want to come to this set of double notches. There should be a double notch on the side back panel as well as a coordinating double notch on the mid back. Bring those notches exactly together while being sure that the edges of the fabric are also perfectly aligned, and place a pin at the notches. Next, we want to look at any remaining sections and continue to pin by splitting them in half. So I'll look at this portion up here between the top and the notches, and I want to pull the fabric together to align the edges as much as possible, and then we'll place a pin right in the center of the two that we already have. So you basically want to keep splitting the difference of all remaining sections of the seam. Now we'll come down and do the same thing with the lower portion. See how I kind of adjusted everything over to help this lie more smoothly? Align the edges, approximate the middle of that section, and pin. It's definitely going to feel like you have to pull and manipulate the edges of the fabric a bit because the curvature of these two pieces is different. So whatever it takes, you gotta pull those edges together. So let's go ahead and just split those sections up one more time with pins. I'll come to these two right here, align the edges, and pin halfway. Same thing right here, align the edges, and pin halfway. Repeating all the way up to the top. Now that we have our first side back pinned, let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other side back before we sew. I'm going to open this panel up, bring in our other side back, and we will also position it right sides together against the mid back. And we'll repeat the pinning process the same way for the other side back. Now that both of our side back panels are pinned to the mid back, we're ready to sew. We're going to be going all the way down both of these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at both ends. Take your first princess seam and place it under the presser foot, aligned with your 1/2 inch seam allowance line. Also with the needle positioned just a little ways down from the top edge of the fabric to allow for a back stitch. I have that pin still in place, and it's fine to leave a pin there while you position everything under the presser foot, but the #1 rule of sewing with pins is you never, ever, ever sew over the pins. You could break your needle and cause segments of needle to come flying up at you, or even worse, your needle could push the pin down inside the machine and cause some pretty bad long-term damage. So ultimately, it's always the best practice to remove your pins as you come to them one by one. Let's start with a back stitch. And now I'm coming forward again. Remove the pin, and we'll continue forward with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat the same process for the other side. After sewing your princess seams, we're going to be treating them now as welt seams, which means we will press the seam allowances to one side and top stitch them in place. Different sewers have preferences on what the preferred direction is to press this type of seam. I prefer to press the seam allowances towards the center of the garment, since that is the same direction that you would press any dart excess when you have a vertical dart in a garment. So we'll be pressing both of the seam allowances towards the mid-back panel. The best way to do this is to start from the right side of the fabric. So I'm going to reach underneath and be sure that I feel my seam allowance for this princess seam going towards the mid-back. Really feel underneath to make sure both flaps of fabric are going in the proper direction. And then you'll take your iron and press them in place. Feel free to use a bit of steam if it feels necessary. And then repeat the same for the other seam. From the wrong side, your seams should now look like this. Seam allowances going towards the center. Top stitching is the process of stitching through all layers of fabric from the outside of the garment. We're going to be top stitching a 1/4 inch over from our seams on the side that has the seam allowance underneath, so that we are stitching the seam allowance onto the mid-back. I'm able to use the side of my presser foot as a guide for a 1/4 inch, since you won't be able to see the lines on your throat plate underneath. If you're on a home sewing machine with a slightly wider presser foot, then the side of your presser foot will not equal 1/4 inch, and you'll want to use the following technique. To do a perfect 1/4 inch top stitch or seam allowance on a home sewing machine, you typically can't just use the right side of the presser foot, as the feet on most home sewing machines is wider than that of an industrial. See, if I bring my ruler in here and I have the 0 edge of it aligned with the right side of the presser foot, you can see that my needle, when it comes down, is almost about 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the ruler and the side of the presser foot. And yes, that 1/8 of an inch really does make a difference. So, to sew a perfectly measured 1/4 inch using the right side of the presser foot, we're simply going to move our needle over to the right until the distance from the needle to the side of the presser foot is exactly 1/4 of an inch. So you'll want to find your machine's needle position function. It's either a dial that you turn or a button that you push if it's a digital machine. And I'm just going to bump my needle over a couple times until it is now coming down in line with the 1/4 inch mark on the ruler. So now the distance from my needle to the right outer side of the presser foot is exactly 1/4 inch, and I can use the side of the presser foot as a 1/4 inch guide for top stitching and 1/4 inch seams. Your main thing that you must remember though is as soon as you are done with the technique in which you need that 1/4 inch guide, you want to be sure to move your needle back to its default position. Now that my needle is moved over, I can bring in the seam that I want to top stitch, and I can align the seam with the right outside edge of my presser foot and sew a perfect 1/4 inch top stitch. To top stitch my seam, it's not usually necessary to do a back stitch. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of the seam, aligning the side of the presser foot with my princess seam stitch line. Stop every once in a while and check by feel that your seam allowances are all still going in the correct direction and that they haven't accidentally flipped to the other side of the seam underneath. In sewing, it's actually very important to use your sense of touch as well. Don't just rely on what you can see, because sometimes crazy stuff will be happening on the underside. So always use your fingertips to feel what you're sewing as well. Repeat the same process for the other side. Next, you'll want to grab both of your yokes. You should have 2 of them. The yoke covers the upper portion of the back, from the shoulder blade up to the actual shoulder seam. Depending on the pattern you're using, your yokes may or may not have a notch in the center along the yoke seam. If it doesn't, then you'll want to add one yourself. Having more notches when you're sewing will help your seams be much more evenly distributed. So take your yoke, each one, fold them in half, and along the lower straight edge, find where your fabric folds and come in and clip a little notch for yourself to indicate the center of that seam. Repeat the same thing for both yokes. As well as for your back, right in the center of the mid-back panel. We need a notch on this side of the seam that will correspond to the ones we made on the yokes. So fold it in half. And clip a little notch to indicate the center. Next, lay both of your yokes out on your table with the right side facing up. We're going to be sandwiching the lower back that we've already constructed in between the 2 yokes, while the yokes have their right sides together. So while the yokes are positioned just like this, bring your lower back in with the right side facing up as well, and place it onto the yoke that is oriented in this direction. Then take your other yoke and flip it down over the top of everything. So the resulting sandwich that we're forming has both yokes with their right sides together, and the lower back is in between the 2 of them. We're going to be pinning and sewing this seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just as we learned before, the best way to pin a seam is always beginning and end points first, and then any notches. So we're going to follow the same protocol here. The lower back does have a slight curve to it, whereas the yokes are straighter. So you're going to be making sure that you pull all 3 edges of fabric together along this entire seam as you pin. So I'll match the edges all together, 1, 2, 3, right at the corner, and pin perpendicular to the direction that we'll be sewing. Then I'll come way down to the bottom of the seam and pin the same thing. Next, Find those center notches that we created on all 3 pieces and make sure those are perfectly aligned as you pin the seam in the center. Match the notches, 1, 2, 3. And pin. Next, we're going to find this portion right here and pin right about in the center of it. So bring the edges of the fabric together. It even helps if you give them a little tug to make sure all 3 layers are evenly distributed across this section. And pin right about where your princess seam is. Same thing down here. And then let's go ahead and place pins halfway in these sections one more time. Check your edges at all points and make sure they're together. Now that our yoke seam is thoroughly pinned, we're going to sew it all the way down with 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at both ends. After sewing our yoke seam, we're then going to take both of the yokes, bring them upwards, and press across the yoke seam. So I'll grab the upper one as well as the lower yoke, bring them upward, and really pull them up as much as possible so that you don't catch any little folds or ridges in your seam as you press. First come from one side, then flip your garment over and press from the other side as well to be sure that all of this excess fabric is also brought upwards. After pressing your yoke seam, you'll then set your back aside until we're ready to attach it to the front at the shoulder seams. Next, we'll be sewing our pocket and stitching it on to the left front of our shirt. If you plan on doing any sort of decorative stitching or embroidery or any painted design that you want to extend all the way to the edges of the pocket, then you'll want to do that prior to this step. To start, we need to mark some guidelines for our pressing. We're going to come to the upper edge of the pocket and using your marking device of choice, I have a white chalk pencil here because I'm on black fabric, you are going to draw a line 1/4 inch down from the upper edge of the pocket. Next, you'll want to draw another line across between the 2 notches that you have, which are 1¼ inches down from the top edge. So I'm going to align my ruler with both of these notches and draw another line. This line here will indicate the finished upper edge of the pocket. So also be sure if you're decorating your pocket that parts of the design you want to be seen don't extend beyond this line that we have connecting the notches. Next, we're going to draw a 1/2 inch line in from the remaining edges. This is where we'll be pressing the sides of the pocket under. 1/2 inch, Next, using your iron, you're going to press that upper 1/4 inch edge towards the wrong side of the pocket. So I'm going to flip my pocket over so that as I fold it up, I can see my line at the edge and be sure that I'm pressing exactly on that 1/4 inch line. After the 1/4 inch is pressed, you'll fold it downwards again and press along your second line, the one that's drawn between the 2 notches. After pressing both of these creases, you should have a nice even 1 inch fold down on the top edge of the pocket. After pressing, you want to come back to the top of your pocket and unfold the last crease that we pressed. And on that line, the one that's drawn between the 2 notches, you're then going to fold the pocket hem backwards so that you now have the right sides together. But you want to keep that 1/4 inch fold in place. So your fold that you're creating right here should be exactly at the notch. Place 1 or 2 pins along the folded area here. One near the upper fold and then one down here at the 1/4 inch fold. We're going to be doing a short little seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance just across the folded area of the pocket. This will create a nice little corner seam that will give us a clean finish on the upper corners of the pocket. So I'll come to the other side and fold it the same way. I'm reverse folding where I have that crease already pressed at the notch, keeping the 1/4 inch fold in place. Pin 1 and 2. We're going to be stitching across this accordion folded area of our pocket at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're going to try to squeeze in a little back stitch at the beginning and end of the section. So I'll start just a little ways below the upper fold. Go backwards just until I drop off the fold, and then come forward. You should see that your stitches are also in line with the chalk line that you already have drawn. Continue sewing till you're at the lower fold, and then go backwards a few. Repeat the same process for the other side. After sewing the sides of the pocket hem, we're going to take that upper folded area and flip it right side out to push our corners outwards. Come in with a point turner or a pencil if you must to push those corners out nice and sharp. And in doing so, you should start to see that the sides of your pocket are already beginning to come inwards at that 1/2 inch line that we have drawn in place. So you're going to use your iron and continue to press that 1/2 inch towards the wrong side. So make sure you're folding it exactly on your chalk lines. Do the same for the lower sections. Also come back to your upper hem at the top of the pocket and just give it a redo on the pressing to help it really settle into place now. When you flip your pocket over, you want to check that the pocket shape looks symmetrical. If any side looks a little bit wonky, then you'll want to come back and adjust as needed. Sometimes it just means taking one portion and rolling it a little bit further inwards to even out the shape of the pocket. Before we stitch our pocket down, we also want to remove a little bit of the bulkiness around these corners. We end up with a lot of excess layers of fabric as we fold all that back. So we're going to do a little bit of a corner clipping to reduce it. Flip your pocket over, and you want to unfold the sides and the bottom and take a look at the 1/2 inch lines that you have drawn. At the bottom here, where these lines cross each other, we have this little diamond shape. We're going to pretty much cut that away, but not exactly on our lines. Instead, we want to space our clipping back by about 1/8 of an inch, but still remove that similar shape. So see how I can see my line right here, but I'm going to come down about 1/8 of an inch and cut, and do the same thing from this side to cut. Now we'll repeat the same thing on both of the sides. So just observe that little diamond shape and cut away a slightly smaller diamond, almost to the lines, but not quite. Then refold the sides and the bottom and press again. And you'll see a noticeable difference in the thickness at these corners. We're going to hem the top of the pocket before we edge stitch it onto the front of the shirt. So I'm going to have the wrong side of my pocket facing up, and we're going to be edge stitching about 1/16 of an inch away from this upper fold. I have my fold aligned to the inner edge of my presser foot, and I'm starting a little ways down from the top to allow room for a back stitch. And I want to also do a back stitch as I come to the very bottom. Next, we'll be edge stitching our pocket onto the left front of our shirt. When we're defining left and right in a garment, it is the left and right when the garment is being worn. So in that case, this will be our left front. The left front is also the side with the 2 drill holes, as I have highlighted in white. These are your pocket placement indicators. We're going to be placing our upper corners of our pocket 1/4 inch above as well as 1/4 inch outwards from the drill hole placements. So I'm going to actually measure that out and give myself a little guideline in placing the pocket. I want to come to this first drill hole right here and place my ruler so that I have one edge 1/4 inch above the drill hole and the side edge of my ruler is 1/4 of an inch outward from the drill hole. And then I can mark a little L-shaped bracket. Now we'll do the same thing mirrored on the other side. So for this drill hole, I'm going to mark 1/4 of an inch outward and above as well. So I match my drill hole to the 1/4 inch mark on the ruler that's inward from both of those sides, and we can draw the same bracket shape. Then bring your pocket in and match the upper corners of it to those markings. Also be sure that the lower portion of your pocket is positioned straight. You'll want this left side of the pocket to be running parallel with the center front of the shirt. I'm going to first pin at the upper corners of the pocket. Perpendicular to our stitch line. Be sure that the rest of your pocket is sitting nice and straight with the left side running parallel to your center front. And then kind of diagonally pin the remaining corners. Next, we'll take this over to the machine and we're going to be edge stitching. Starting from the top hemline of the pocket, we'll come down and pivot at each of the corners until we finish at the other side. Being sure to, of course, not stitch across the top of the pocket because then we would be closing it up and it would no longer be a pocket. Starting from the top hem of the pocket, but a little ways down from it, I'm going to assume my edge stitching position, which again is sewing about 1/16 of an inch in from the fold, and we'll begin by going in reverse, just until I drop off the top edge of the pocket. As I approach the first corner, I want to be sure to land with my needle down in the fabric and about the same 1/16 of an inch spacing from the bottom. While the needle is down, raise your presser foot, rotate to the next section, and if it looks like your edge stitching is a good spacing, then you can continue. However, it kind of looks like I haven't gone far enough, as my stitching will be a little bit too deep onto the folded area. So I'm going to rotate back, lower my stitch length to like a 1 millimeter, and just walk forward another baby stitch length. Be sure that you return to your normal 2.5 millimeter stitch length as you rotate and continue to the next section. Now I'm nicely lined up to keep my edge stitching consistent. Do the same thing at each remaining corner. When you come to the very top again, drop right off of the fold and finish with a back stitch. After completing your pocket, it's also nice to give a final press over the top to help the stitches sort of settle in a little bit more and give you a nice crisp finish. Once the pocket is in place, we can move on to the facings. To sew our front facings, you'll want to grab both sides of your shirt fronts, as well as both of your facings. In cutting our facings, we block fused the pieces, so you should already have fusible interfacing attached to the wrong side of your facings. The side without the interfacing, the fabric side, is considered the right side. You're going to separate your two facings and place one onto each shirt front with the right sides together. So it should look like you're stitching this onto the outside of the garment, even though ultimately it will end up on the inside. We're going to be stitching our facings onto our fronts, starting at this upper notch that's about 1 inch in from the corner. We'll be stitching from here, pivoting at the corner and coming all the way down the center front. So we want to pin that portion of each of these seams before we sew. First, come all the way down to the bottom, make sure your edges are aligned, and pin perpendicular to the seam line, then come all the way up to this upper corner and pin as well. We won't be sewing all the way onto the neckline, but it will help the piece sit nicely if we place another pin right up here at the corner where the neckline meets the shoulder seam. Next, we have a notch right here, so make sure the notches of both the facing and the shirt front are matched, and pin at the notch. Then we'll pin halfway between these two, and halfway between these two. For For a seam like this that's long and straight and sitting on the lengthwise grain of the fabric, we can get away with more spaced out pins. But other times when you're sewing something that's curved or a little more intricate, then you'll want to continue pinning until you have more pins that are closer together. Go ahead and pin the other shirt front the same way. After pinning, we're ready to sew, and we're going to be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting from the bottom, coming all the way up the center front, pivoting at the corner, and ending exactly at that notch. But you want to be sure to not have any of your stitching go beyond the notch, because this is the space in which we need to insert our collar, so no stitching should pass this notch. Starting at the bottom, I'm going to make sure that the right edge of my seam is aligned with my 1/4 inch line, backstitch, and then come forward. Coming up to my corner here, and to pivot, we want to be sure that we don't sew all the way to the bottom edge. I want to stop a 1/4 inch short of that. So I want to walk forward 1 stitch at a time, make sure your needle's down, raise the presser foot, rotate, and we'll continue just to the notch, but not beyond it. And once you're at the notch, finish with a small backstitch. Repeat the same thing on the other shirt front. After our facings are seamed onto the front, we'll want to understitch this seam as well to help the facing stay rolled to the inside of the garment when it's being worn. However, we're not going to be understitching the entire length of the center front. Instead, we're only going to understitch from the bottom up to this notch that you have that's a little bit further up than midway. That's our stopping point for the understitching. The reason for this is that when our garment is worn, if the upper section is unbuttoned and the lapel folds open, our facing will then be on the outside of the garment, and we don't want to see any visible understitching along this upper portion. So we're going to take our facing and fold it open, and don't worry about this upper section where you have the corner, just focus on the main majority of the seam that's straight. And you want to be pressing so that you feel your seam allowance going towards the facing rather than being folded down towards the body of the garment. So starting from as high up as you reasonably can get your iron in, just pull it open and press your facing open with the seam allowance going in the same direction as it. After pressing, flip it over and check underneath to make sure that your seam allowance is behaving. You should see it all going in this direction towards the facing and not flipped opposite ways or catching any weird little folds. Since we'll be doing our understitching from the right side of the garment, we won't be able to see the little notch that we have that's an indicator of how far to understitch. So it's really helpful if you fold this back and take a look at where the notch is located, and then on the right side of everything, just place a pin, just so you know where to stop your understitching. For our understitching, we're going to be edge stitching about 1/16 of an inch over from the seam on the facing side, also being sure that our seam allowance is on that side of the seam underneath. For starting at the very bottom edge of the garment, this end is going to get enclosed in the hem, so we don't need to backstitch. But when we come up to our notch, which is midway along the seam, we'll want to do a nice little backstitch there to secure it. So right as I come up to the pin, I want to remove it and finish by going in reverse for 3 or 4 stitches. Your completed understitching should look about like this in terms of spacing. After understitching, we're going to be taking the facing, turning it to the inside of the garment and pressing along the center, front, and corner seam. But first, we have to do a little bit of clipping around this corner. We have two different types of clips we need to make. First off, we want to reduce a little bit of the bulk around this corner. So hold your shears at a 45-degree angle so that you're cutting the seam allowance away almost up to where your stitch line is, but not to it or cutting the stitches in any way. So just a little snip to remove the corner excess. Then you want to come to this notch right here, the one that indicated where to stop sewing. As you can see, it's already clipped inward, but there's a little bit more distance it can go before it's at the stitches. So right where the notch already is, continue to clip it a tiny bit more until you're just exactly at your stitch line. Next, come to that corner and we're going to flip it right side out. And then we'll get up inside the corner with a point turner or pencil if you must, whatever your chosen point turning tool is. We want that corner turned out nice and sharp. Now we can press all the way up our center front seam. Starting at the top here, see how when we did that little corner clip, it made it so now the seam allowance of the neck can come outwards while this little portion here up to the corner is going inward. You should see a perfect right angle shape happening right here where you clipped inwards. So I'm going to start pressing at the corner. And we're going to press all the way down the center front. As we come down and press the understitched portion, you'll see that the understitching actually naturally creates that little offset for us. It helps the contrast roll inward just that teeny tiny bit. Typically, the edge of a facing on the inside of the garment does not get seamed onto another piece of fabric. So in most cases in commercial sewing, you'll see that they'll use a stitch to finish the raw edge of the fabric to keep it from further unraveling. This can be done in one of two ways. The most common way that you'll see in the industry is by using the machine called the serger to create an overlock stitch along the edge. However, this is an entirely separate piece of equipment from the standard home sewing machine. So if you do not have a serger, you can also achieve similar results by using a 3-step zigzag stitch on your home sewing machine. This stitch will be sewn close to the edge of the fabric to keep the threads from fraying. If you desire to finish the edge of your facing, then you'll want to do it right now with either of these two methods before proceeding on to the following steps. Next, we're going to stay stitch along our necklines. Stay stitching will help the facing stay attached to the neckline so that they'll behave like one piece of fabric, and it'll make it much easier for us to sew our collar on later. We're going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of the fabric along the curved portion of the neckline. We want to sew it at that 1/8 of an inch so that when we attach our collar at 1/4 inch seam allowance, the stay stitch will be hidden inside and not visible. The other great purpose of stay stitching is that it'll keep the neckline from getting stretched out as we sew, because that can tend to happen along curved seams. Before we stay stitch, we'll just place a few pins in to hold the layers together. Maybe one at the 1/4 and another halfway along the curve. As we stay stitch, you can sort of approximate that 1/8 of an inch. Just know that you want to be sewing at something less than what your 1/4 inch seam allowance would be. And there's no need to backstitch along our stay stitching. Do the same thing for both sides. While in many cases a facing is left loose on the inside of the garment, we're actually going to be stitching it down onto the shirt fronts, and this will keep it from flapping around loosely inside the garment. So you're going to follow the line of your facing edge and sew it through to the shirt front at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, all the way down on both sides of your shirt. Before stitching the facing down, it'll definitely help us out if we place a few pins. Otherwise, the facing could tend to get dragged downward as we sew, and we want it to sit nice and flat against the shirt front. So we'll pin it in place first. Place your pins maybe just about every 6 inches apart or so. No need to go overboard with this one. But I'm just pinning the facing onto the shirt front along the edge. Now that I've pinned the facing to the shirt fronts, I'm just going to follow the edge of the facing and stitch 1/4 of an inch inwards from it. Repeat the same thing for both sides.